I'd like to introduce Alun Griffiths MW, who is co-founder of the Old Vine Conference, together with Sarah Abbott, who's also Master of Wine, and Leo Austin. Alun has 40 years experience in the wine trade. He was a wine buyer for Fortnum and Mason and then for Harrods, before becoming wine director at Berry Brothers and Rudd, covering UK, Singapore, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. In 2013, he became international director at the VATS Group in China. I'd also like to thank Alun for joining us, and Belinda Stone, who's marketing manager for OVC, as well as Amanda Barnes, OVC ambassador to South America, who together with myself will be sharing our respective experiences with the countries we represent. Thank you. Belinda, I think you can start the sharing.
Okay, well, I'll make a start, and it's a great privilege to be invited to speak to such a prestigious group of wine writers. So thank you very much for taking the time to come and listen. The way this will work, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background to the Old Vine Conference and what the objectives are. Most of you will know the importance of old vines. I don't want to try and preach to the converted here, but I want to talk about my own experience and how I've come into the Old Vine Conference and what the Old Vine concept means to me. And as Andrea said, then we're going to ask Amanda Barnes and Michele Shah to speak a little bit more about the areas that they are specifically interested in and knowledgeable about. And then I will come back at the end to talk about the future. So could we move them to the next slide, please, Belinda? Old vines, not everybody knows the significance of old vines. Most people in the wine profession do, but the consumers don't. And what really one of the origins of the Old Vine Conference was that we see all around the world old vines being uprooted and replanted, mainly for reasons of economy. The way the global wine trade is set up, it caters more for the mass market. The vast majority of wines are designed to be drunk young. They're designed to be made in bulk, sold in bulk, as in large scale retail. And it's known that if you have old vines, they are less productive in terms of the volume of wine that they produce. And so if your interest as a producer is to produce the maximum quantity you can at the lowest price, then old vines have little place in your world. However, if you work in the high quality end of the market, old vines can be hugely useful to you. And my background, Michele explained my background, and those companies that I've worked for have largely been, I've been fortunate enough to work in companies which work at the top end of the quality spectrum. And therefore, that's brought me into contact far more with small scale artisanal producers whose objective is to produce high quality wine, not to produce huge volumes of wine. And there's one thing I've noticed they all have in common, those sort of producers, is an immense respect for nature. They want to make wines which reflect their origins. And they are deeply conscious of the exact nature of the terroir and the geology, the climate, where their vines are planted. So they have this great understanding and respect for nature. Could we have the next slide, please, Belinda? So we're looking to safeguard the cultural qualitative heritage of old vines. And I don't intend to read all these for you. You can read these perfectly well for yourselves. But it's not the case that old vines automatically make superior wine. Generally, they do. But of course, they have to be healthy vines in the first place. There are old vines which are diseased, which are ill in their vineyard, and they need to be removed. But by and large, it's axiomatic to say that a well-tended, healthy old vine will produce superior wine when compared to a younger vine. And I'm talking here about the difference between, we haven't got a definition really, other than in South Africa, of what old vines means, which I'll come to in a moment. But I'm really talking about vines that are over 30, 40 years old, because a vine is probably at its most economically viable in terms of its production, its volume production, when it's in its teens. And then after about 20 years, the quality might go up, but the quantity begins to decline. So old vines also have a role to play in propagating new vineyards. In terms of, we've noticed in South Africa that when people are trying to plant a new vineyard and imbue it character, they've often used cuttings from very old vineyards, which have then been able to produce more interesting crop, a more interesting quality of fruit than if a simple new vine was planted. So they have a role to play in the future. Could we have the next slide, please, Belinda? Right. So we talked about the quality. There's another thing, which is the question of agricultural heritage. I've noticed when I visit wineries, when I visit producers, small scale producers mostly this has been in Europe, I must confess, but because that's where most of my career has taken me. But when I go and talk to a grower and we start talking about his vineyard and his or her vineyard, and they'll say to me, oh, this is a wine that's from our best vineyard, it's just the other side of the hill. And I say, well, what's so special about that? And they'll say, well, it's the vines, it's the old vines. They were planted by my great-grandfather in 1907 or something. And it makes you realize that if it's often, the vineyard has a role to play, not just in making wine, but in the life of that village, in the history of that village. It's been passed down from generation to generation. And the people that live in that village come to know that vineyard and its importance to them. If you go back to using that vineyard 1907, for example, imagine what that vineyard has seen. It's been through the First World War, the Great Depression, the Second World War, and all the times that since then. And you can imagine that it almost has it's like a thread running through the life of that village. So there's this, not just the agricultural heritage, and it's the social side of it, the social thread running through that village and through the community that lives there. We've spoken a moment ago about the importance of retaining the genetic diversity and the genetic material, which is extremely important in the fight against diseases. It's noticeable when we've had in the last couple of years, well, last few years, we've had some climate extremes in certain vineyards. And when you talk to people, talk to growers, they've said the drought, for example, that we've had some extremes of heat and some extremes of drought in Europe in the last few years. And you talk to some producers and I say, how was your vineyard coped? He said, I've lost all my young vines, all the fruit from the young vines has gone. They couldn't cope. But the old vines have just sailed through it. It's as though they are almost, they're so well established and they've been around for so long that they know how to deal with extremes of temperature, variations, and rooted. They can get their moisture in times of drought from meters below the surface, which the young vines can't. And so they've got this amazing resilience, and it's useful to, again, to take the genetic material from these old vines to inform what we do in the future in terms of combating diseases and pests. And the next slide, please, Belinda. So these are the people we've all been introduced very kindly by Michele and Andrea. So Sarah has done a lot of work for years, long before the Old Vine Conference was formed. Sarah was involved in work with old vines. Leo was provided most of the funding. I do what I'm invited to do. As I said, my experience is very much more commercial. I've been working as a buyer and a seller, and more recently as an educator. So my world has not been that of being a viticulturalist, a grower, a producer, a scientist. it's very much on the commercial side. And again, I'll talk a little bit about how that manifests itself in terms of the old vine concept later on. And Belinda, of course, who's been introduced already, as she does a lot of the marketing for the Old Vine Conference. And the next one, please. And the Old Vine Conference, which was set up in March 2021, we've been overwhelmed by the response from within the trade and from the educators and writers like yourselves, and particularly by the growers, the producers themselves. And so in addition to those 4 people that are the 3 founders and Belinda, we've got all these regional ambassadors who are extremely not their own right in their own worlds. And you can see the spread, the geographical spread of where they come from, and reflecting the diversity of where we find old vines. They really are all over the world. In fact, it's by no means focused just in Europe. We look at areas like the Middle East and South Africa, of course, as well, and Greece down there in the Balkans. In fact, less so in probably some of the more modern parts of Europe. So anyway, there's a huge level, a huge network there, a huge web of support around the world for the Old Vine Conference. And we see the role as being very much educational. I mentioned at the beginning that a lot of people within the wine trade and within the wine world, people like yourselves, educators and writers, are aware of the importance of old vines, the qualitative implications of old vines, and the importance of maintaining the cultural, social heritage of them. But the consumer doesn't have that same degree of knowledge at all. So education is a key role, and that's really what the Old Vine Conference has as one of its other objectives, be preservation of the vineyards. It's to inform, it's to educate consumers as to why it's important to maintain them, and what is the benefit of drinking wines made from old vines as well. And the next slide, please, Belinda. So already, as I said, we've had 2 years which have been, of course, afflicted by the COVID issue, which has stopped us meeting as often as we'd like. An awful lot of work has had to go on remotely on Zoom, and that will continue because of the geographical spread of people who want to take part in the conferences. But here's the program for this year. As you can see, there are conferences, there are workshops, there's field trips, there's award ceremonies, trophy results, there's the Old Vine Trophy Awards and so on. So there's a whole program of things going on throughout the whole year, and which is just continuing to send the message out. And we hope to develop regional chapters in places like Italy, China, and the USA. China will be very interesting because although we think of China, I have quite a lot of experience of China in the last 8 years, and although we think of China as a new wine country, they have actually had vineyards there for several centuries, albeit not on a terribly commercial scale, and not on a scale that's been able to be seen by many other people outside of China, but it's growing fast. And in terms of the engagement within the Old Vine Conference, we've seen not just the regional ambassadors who've joined, but we've had sponsors and members who have joined in. And again, you'll be struck here by the geographical spread. We've got England, Australia, Italy, Lebanon, France in various guises, Italy again in various guises, Chile is there, Spain, and the Languedoc. So again, there's been a huge amount of engagement. We've been overwhelmed in the Old Vine Conference by the interest, by the level of interest here. Certainly, this is from the producer side, from the press side, and from the importers and distributors around. Some of these are commercial people. Some of them are, in fact, all of them, of course, are making wine, and some are in a more commercial level, but still have old vines and they want to focus on them. So we've been thrilled by this level of uptake. So there's a bit of background about the Old Vine Conference and what it seeks to do and how I see its importance. I'll talk a bit more later on about my personal experience. But now I think I'd like to invite Amanda Barnes to talk a little bit about her own area of expertise and knowledge, namely South America. And Belinda, if you'd like to get Amanda's slides up, and
super.
Off you go, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Alan. I've just moved to my phone because my internet has just started to go out at the wrong time. So please, if anything's not clear, let me know. So looking at the kind of, briefly at the old vines of South America, I think what really amazes me is continuing to discover these incredible pockets of old vines here in South America. And we really do have a lot, especially spread through Chile, Argentina, but also Bolivia and Peru. The kind of story of wine in South America really starts in the 1500s. And that's when we, start to see the first vines being spread across the continent. And if you go to the next slide, Belinda, I think a key part of that story are these first vines, which is what we kind of call the Criolla grape varieties. So coming from those first two varieties, which is Listan Prieto, which you probably know as País in Chile. It's got lots of different names, Misionera, Criolla Chica, but that was the most widely planted in the period of the 1500s and 1600s, and continues to be one of the most important, specifically in Chile today. But also Moscatel de Alejandría, which was also one of those first vines to be planted and spread quite widely throughout the continent. And mainly from those two, we get this enormous family tree, this great diversity of varieties which are unique to South America. Patricia, it's the Criolla family tree slide that hopefully is up there. So hopefully you can see that with all the different grape varieties. Then there's lots of really interesting and exciting varieties that are quite hard to find outside of South America, like Vistroqueña in Bolivia. You've got all your kind of 3 different Torrontés varieties here. And they really do kind of form a great part of our old vine heritage, which continues today. So we get these incredible old vines of these varieties from the 1800s, still in production, and certainly still fruitful. And then we have the second kind of period. If you want to move to the next slide, I think, but we have the second period of our kind of old vine story starting in the 1800s. So here in this slide, these are some of the key varieties that I really recommend hunting down, because you're really unlikely to find any new varieties of these. You might find some new plantings of Torrontés, but the rest will all be very old vine. So País being really kind of central to our old vine story. That's the Listan Prieto, where we have over 10,000 hectares in Chile. And just kind of as a key understanding, in Chile, we have this enormous concentration of old vines. We have over 15,000 hectares of vines that are well over 60 years old. So I think Chile probably beats any country in the world in terms of the quantity of old vines that we still have there. And then Argentina, we have at least 7,000 hectares of very old vines over 60. So, obviously kind of coming to a decision on the terminology and when an old vine becomes old is a big conversation. But in Chile and Argentina, we have quite significant quantities. Torrontés is obviously a really key old vine for us here in Argentina, many of which are at least in their 60s, often over 100 years old as well. Criolla Grande is the most planted of the kind of significant Criolla varieties that can produce quality wines in Argentina as well. And we're seeing a great renaissance of Criolla Grande at the moment, especially in Eastern Mendoza, with younger producers making a very juicy, gluggable rosé, which is great for the summer weather that I'm in right now, although I appreciate that most of you are in winter. And then we also have Pedro Jimenez, not at all similar to the Pedro Jimenez of Spain. This is a native Criolla variety, and really quite significant in plantings in Argentina as well. Makes a very light, fresh, quite simple wine, but there's also some very interesting movements here of producers working with biological aging, flor, in order to kind of give a slightly more saline and intriguing character to this. So that's another one to look forward to. Vischoqueña in Bolivia, which is a very unique grape variety in this incredible landscape of old vines in the Sinti Valley, where I know I discussed this when we did our South America seminar last year, but where the vines are just incredible because they grow around these big trees of pink peppercorn, the moye trees, which is the typical way that the Jesuits started planting these vineyards hundreds of years ago, and a method that's been retained for the old vines, not so much kind of recreated for new vines, but the old vines have been retained in that way. And then the key one of the key ones in Peru, I think, for quality is Quebranta, which is one of the classic Pisco varieties. But today we have this incredible renaissance of quality winemaking with these Pisco varieties as well. Still very niche, but really quite promising and exciting. I think the key thing in South America that really interests me about the old vines is the incredible three things: the incredible diversity of varieties when we're looking at these native varieties, these Criollo varieties, but also what happens in the 1800s, in 1850s. And if you want to move to the next slide, Belinda, we have this immigration of other European varieties happening at the same time that we have this significant immigration of Europeans happening in South America. And so we get this huge diversity come in of lots of other varieties too. So you can find very old vine Chasselas, which I know, you know, anyone that's spent a significant time in Switzerland, you know, perhaps will not realize that Chile has quite significant plantings too. We've got Biquignol, which I think has disappeared from most places. We have lots of really kind of diverse old vine varieties and genetic material. And unlike most kind of countries in the world, because Chile has never been affected by phylloxera and Argentina very insignificantly too, most of these are still ungrafted on their own roots. And so we have this great diversity of different varieties brought from the 1800s, and which have certainly, as Alan mentioned, been propagated. And this kind of massal selection is a very common way of planting new vineyards in South America too. And many of these have also traveled back to Europe. So I know, you know, Chile has been a great provider, for example, of Carmenere. Argentina has been a great provider of Malbec as well. And so I think that diversity of varieties is really key to the identity of the old vines that we find in South America. But then the other part that's really interesting is the social aspect. And I think when we do talk about old vines, we do talk about a social aspect, because most of our old vines are cared for by families and generations of growers. So for País alone, we have over 8,000 growers in Chile. So whenever you're buying a bottle, you know that you are supporting the family and typically very small growers behind it. And then thirdly, environmental. And Alan already touched on this, that in South America, drought is a common occurrence. We don't have much rainfall in the majority of our wine regions, or at least the ones that we're talking about with old vines. And the majority of old vines are dry farmed, and they are also much more resistant to those temperature peaks that are becoming increasingly common with climate change. So that is certainly, you know, the positive qualities of old vines, as well as the kind of qualitative factors when it comes to winemaking. But there are, of course, significant challenges. And so when we were preparing for this meeting, Belinda asked me to touch on some of the kind of opportunities as well, in order to support the old vines and not continue to lose them at the incredible rate that sadly we are. And in South America, we're losing them at a very fast rate too. So if we move to the next slide, the challenges obviously are the kind of price points. Most of these old vines, especially because they're often from less famous grape varieties, they don't achieve the same price point as as some of the more desirable international ones too. So the ways that we can kind of support it and some of the initiatives that are happening that are really key. The first is Vigno in Chile. And I'm sure most of you, I hope most of you are aware of Vigno, which stands for Viñadores de Carignán. And this was like a club really that started with some winemakers in Chile who all loved the old vine Carignán there and decided to start making it between themselves. And then when the 2010 earthquake happened in Chile, which was devastating and killed lots of people, but also destroyed many of the wineries and livelihoods of people, especially in the southern regions of Maule and Atata, they decided to make it official and start focusing on the kind of resurrection of these old vine Carignán and supporting the growers in order to try and, you know, bring some economic activity into this downtrodden area. So Vigno, the kind of principles of Vigno is that the vines have to be over 30 years old. Typically they're over 70, or typically they are 70 years old. So that's just the minimum, but normally they're much older. They have to be dry farmed. And there's some other kind of criteria too. It can be a field blend, but predominantly Carignan. But the really interesting outcome of Vigno is that the old vines of Carignan went from being sold for 10 cents a kilo to over $1.50 a kilo in less than a decade. So it has had a significant impact on the families and the growers and giving them that economic opportunity to retain those vines. In a similar vein, and something which is quite new, is the Al Maule Association. So also focused in Maule, which is our kind of main production area in Chile. And Alma, Maule, Sol and Maule is where the name comes from. And this is entirely focused on país. So producers making país from old vine país in Maule. And part of the focus is not only giving value to the país grapes and growers, but also trying to bring back a wine culture in Chile. So the idea is that these wines have to be sold for less than 20 US. So they have to be accessible for the local kind of population in the area. And they've brought in these huge fridges, which they're putting next to Coca-Cola fridges at, you know, parties and gatherings in order to try and encourage people the young people especially, who typically drink more Coca-Cola and Pisco than they do wine, sadly, trying to encourage them to switch, to transition back to wine in order to not only support the growers by buying their grapes, but try and, you know, incentivize a change and get Chile drinking more wine in order to support their own industry and growers. So that's a really interesting one. There's a few that have come out to export as well, and I do recommend trying them because they're a very fresh, typically juicy style of país and lovely to drink. Again, perfect for summertime. So stock up for when summer comes around. And then also, you know, the other thing to kind of look for and support is when you see growers in South America, when we do say old vine bottlings here, it typically is old vine over 50 years. It is, you know, a marketing term, but most people are doing it from a very genuine place. And Viña Vieja, or old vine, is the way that they will do that. And Pipeño is another one that you can look for, which is the typical way of producing país, always with old vines. Anything that says criolla on the label is going to be coming from these old vines of criolla as well. And then we have lots of kind of incentives, initiatives happening here, especially when it comes to semillon, looking, you know, between producers in Argentina and Chile, trying to identify that old vine semillon and really support those old vines. So I think I might have gone over my allotted time, but if anyone has any questions on South America before we move on, then please do shout out. I thought Pedro Jimenez was once thought to be Pedro Jimenez. No, it's not Pedro Jimenez. It is spelt, interestingly, Pedro Jimenez is spelt in 3 ways here in Argentina, with a G, with a J, and with an X. But it is a native variety and it is not related to Pedro Jimenez from Spain. And I think the name, as with many kind of names that happen in South America, it's picked up from, you know, from their experience in previous kind of lifetimes in Europe. So the same way that our Bonarda here in Argentina is not the same as Bonarda in Italy. And, you know, that we have a region called La Rioja, which has, you know, there was nothing really to do with La Rioja in Spain. I think it's just a common story of immigrants when they arrive in a new land, naming something after something they know, or some confusion of it tasting similar or looking similar. And then our Criollo wines exported from Mark. Hi, Mark. Yes, you can get some Criollo wines exported. Torrontés is definitely the biggest, as well as País. So those are both kind of really starting to see, especially in the US market. I'd say that the US has been a big supporter of País. The UK is a bit slow on the uptake, but hopefully we can change that. But there's definitely lots of Torrontés being exported. And it's interesting to see some of the kind of top, more premium wineries focusing on these varieties, not using them on the label, perhaps because they don't have the same acknowledgement in the international market, and instead going with their regional, you know, regional labels. So Caro Sur is a good example of this in Barriel, in a very high altitude part of San Juan. And often instead of, they don't really put kind of País on the label too much, they just call it after their special parcel of vineyard, which seems to get more kudos than the grape varieties do at the moment. Super, so I will let Michele speak, and thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks, Amanda. Well, I think Italy has enormous potential when it comes to old vines. Their history of winemaking, their 20 regions and hundreds of grape varieties would assume they have parcels of old vines in most regions, and in fact they do. But it seems there is still not sufficient awareness from the producers, and certainly little awareness from consumers on the wealth of these vines, which are both of cultural and historic value. In some ways, I think it's important to differentiate between those producers who are consciously tending to old vines with a history, such as ungrafted or pre-phylloxera, with vines often over 100 years old, planted to indigenous varietals, using traditional trellising systems such as pergola or bush vines, and those who have inherited old vineyards as part of the wealth of their estate, but are not essentially focused on the old vine factor and just use them as part of their estate blend. Another point to consider is that there are many producers in Italy who have vines older than 35 years, yet don't have sufficient number of these old vines to create a separate label. Therefore, the grapes are often thrown in with the estate blend to make up the quantity. And I was talking to one of Soave's producers, one of our new members, Claudio Gini in the Veneto, and he pointed out that one of the reasons why old vines in Italy are endangered is because they do produce low yields, and the price paid for the grapes is the same as for any other vine or grape. And there is, you know, very little commercial motivation, as the growers are often, you know, not justly rewarded. Now, Gini pays his growers extra for the grapes, and for the old vines says, you know, this is a problem that really needs to be addressed. And I'm sure this is an issue that exists in many parts of Italy, that the added value that should be bestowed on these grapes in order to motivate the producers is really not there yet. I'm going to ask Belinda to pass on to slide 2, 3, and 4 in a sort of a rather quick sequence. So as with some of our Italy members, such as Villa Bogdano in Friuli, with the old Tokai Friulano vines, and then we go on to Feudi di San Gregorio's 100-year-old Aglianico vines, and Salvo Forti's I Vigneri's century-old Nerello Mascalese vines on Etna. Well, these producers are part of a category which is consciously aware of the cultural heritage, the resilience, the genetic diversity of these vines, and how these can add value to the image and storytelling of their estate, while testifying to the expertise of preserving old vines, therefore justifying for the higher price that the wines demand, and you know, at a commercial level. So this is a clear message that these wineries are aware of a higher price, which their wines, of course, can command. In the case of Salvo Forti, and I can safely say that most engaged old vine producers that I've encountered share the same opinion, and that is the figure of the viticulturist is very important. Salvo has century-old vines among his vineyards, which he vinifies separately to produce a heritage wine. And he expressed the importance of experience and knowledge that the new generations can learn from previous generations, so as to guarantee the viability of these vines to reach a good age beyond 30 and even up to 100 years. And one of his suggestions for our Italy community meetings or workshops that we sometimes have is to invite some of these older farmers to talk about the techniques used in tending to the vineyards in order to allow the vines to grow old to ripe old age. And so, younger generation of producers don't forget this knowledge and this wealth. It's also particularly reassuring when you encounter cooperatives such as Vincovaglio, one of the OVC members in Piemonte, which has a special label dedicated to its production deriving from old Barbera vines, a label produced from a blend collected from its grape growers with vines that are up to 50 years old. See, as a cooperative coming together under one umbrella, it's one way of saving these vines, which at an individual level could be too few to have an impact. So let's go on to the next slide, and that's another testimony from a smaller cooperative, that's Cave Mont Blanc de Morges et La Salle in Val d'Aosta, with 70 producers and only a total of 17 hectares, most with less than a hectare each, all of indigenous old Prié Blanc pergola vines planted at 1,000 to 1,250 meters and indigenous only to that area. And I'd also like to mention that 4 hectares of these 17 hectares of vines form a project where the younger members of the cooperative assist the older generation of farmers who can no longer actually manage to tend to their vines because of their senior age. And in this way, the vines are saved and continue to be part of a living heritage rather than being grubbed up or dying of neglect. And, there's so many incredible stories to tell. Only last week, I spoke to this small 1.5 hectare producer in Val di Non in Trentino, El Zeremia, who produces 4,000 bottles of almost extinct 150-year-old ancient Guyot vines of Groppello di Revò, which he and his family are responsible for reviving and saving from extinction. And they're only a total of 8 hectares in all of Italy, which derive from these old vines, which have been passed on from generation to generation, with the promise that each generation is to cultivate the vines for a minimum of 10 years and then pass them on to the next generation. So there's some amazing stories. And similarly, the Fratelli a Demanda estate in Taurasi in Campania have vineyards deriving from century-old ungrafted pre-phylloxera vine stock, approximately 200 years old, from which clonal material has been taken to replant the vines of indigenous Roviello Bianco, also in danger of extinction, thus preserving, the genetic heritage of these old vines. So if we go on to the next slide, we have a really heartwarming story which comes from a winemaker, as you can see in the picture, Giovanni Aiello, who has 8 hectares in Puglia. And these are mostly century-old vines, including some as old as 110 years of age. And these vines are farmed by a charming 90 and 92-year-old couple. You can see the one of the couple there, the husband and wife, they're grape growers. And Aiello, like a genie, believes in paying his grape growers a higher price. In fact, he pays 30% more because of the higher quality and the higher value. So there are, some great stories, but there are still, I think, too few growers and producers in Italy acknowledged for the added value of cultivating old vines. And I think this is one of the reasons why the OVC and its presence in Italy and internationally is important, to give voice to such producers to create a community and eventually an Italy chapter that can assist in preserving the heritage while creating a premium specific niche and maybe one day an independent category. Now, a recent national law has just come into effect in Italy to restore, rehabilitate, maintain, and protect heroic and historic vineyards in areas of specific landscapes of historical and environmental value. Now, this is very positive and could be of great assistance if well applied, though it doesn't assist single producers or individual vineyards. It's going to be applied at a regional level by the regional agricultural departments, meaning it depends on the politics and interest of that region. For example, in Piedmont, it has been applied thanks to the UNESCO heritage status, while in regions such as Campania and Sicily, it hasn't been applied yet. There are other organizations in Italy, though not many, that seek out small artisanal producers. One is Proposta Vini, a distributor with a portfolio of 2,800 wines. Their philosophy is to seek out small artisanal producers who produce wines that respect the terroir, traditional viticultural methods, extreme viticultural areas, volcanic areas, pre-phylloxera vineyards, and heritage old vineyards. Then two of their projects incorporate old vines, and that's Vini Franchi, the ungrafted pre-phylloxera wines, and Viti Centenari, century-old vines. Yeah, as the consumer here in Italy, they are not really yet aware of the added value of wines produced from old vines and their wealth of biodiversity or resilience, or their resilience to climate change. And a lot, I think, needs still to be done in terms of awareness and education. But stories such as these of amazing and resilient grape growers and their beautiful vines, often just like sculptures, upholding diversity, producing quality wines, is really what drives me to continue discovering and learning about the old vines of Italy. And it's something that deserves really to be told, to be applauded, sustained, and encouraged. And therefore, it's on this premises that I hope to encourage more and more producers to join the OBC and to eventually build up our own Italy chapter. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if there were any questions. I didn't really sort of look at the questions whilst we were going on, but
there's nothing specific to Italy, Michele, by the looks of it, but
okay. Thank you.
Curious as to why Rioja España is not involved. Does anybody is anybody here with knowledge of the Spanish side of things with old vines in the audience who might know the answer to that? Because I don't actually. Okay, we may have to park that one for the moment. I'm conscious of time, your time, so I'm going to press on now with. I'm going to lead straight on from what Michele was talking about, the consumer there, because with my background, I'm always very conscious of looking at things from a consumer's point of view. Now, my experience as a buyer, when I first started going to cellars and you taste a grower's selection of wines and you taste maybe 3 or 4 wines from the same appellation, and you come to the second and the third, you say, well, why is that one better than the first one? If it's the same appellation, same winemaking techniques, same climate, so what's the difference? He said, older vines. So I said, well, when you talk about old vines here, what is your definition of old? What does that mean? Well, of course, I was mostly in France, and there is no definition in France. There's nothing laid down. South Africa has a legally defined number of years, 35, for their heritage brand, the cultural heritage that they can get a seal which you put on the bottle to say that your wine is made from older than 35-year-old vines. And the result of that is that the consumer has really begun to click into to understand what it means. And if you go to a restaurant now in South Africa and you give you the wine list, you've got white wines, red wines, rosé wines, sparkling wines, and a section on heritage wines, a special section where people can go specifically to look at old vine wines. Now, I don't know of anywhere else in the world that has got to that stage yet, but again, it leads into to when we come to our conclusions of the job that needs to be done. Now, this is an example of a guy that I've been buying wine from for quite some time when I was at Berry Brothers. Jérôme Coursadon is a very unassuming, modest, but brilliant winemaker in Saint-Joseph in the Northern Rhone. And he makes in good years, he makes 4 cuvées of red, but generally 3. They're called Silice, L'Olivet, and Paradis Saint-Pierre, all in ascending order of price and ascending order of quality. And I say to him, okay, what's the backstory on these? Silice, the basic one, is made from 30-year-old vines. The L'Olivet has an average of over 50, and Paradis Saint-Pierre 80. And I said, well, why don't you mention this on your label? He says, because the consumer doesn't really necessarily know. It doesn't mean anything to the consumer in a necessarily in a positive way. If you say to the average consumer, my wine is made from old vines, some consumers might respond by saying, well, is that a good thing? Because not everything in life that we consider to be made from something old is necessarily something good. It's not always a positive connotation. So we need a process of education for sure. And could we have the next slide, Belinda? Sorry. Thanks. So there are, as I said, there's a qualitative argument to convey about why as consumers, we should support old vines. There is an emotional argument as well. We can talk about the heritage and the family tradition, the social side, the cultural heritage and so on. But I think we need a more economic argument as well to get across to the consumer, because if a consumer can be convinced that by buying a wine that's made from older vines, it's worth paying a premium for it. And if that premium can be transported back to the producer, Michele has just mentioned there are producers in Italy who are paying their growers more for their old vine fruit than for their young vine fruit and so on. So that needs to go right through the system. And then I think there's a chance, more than a chance, that the producers themselves will see that there's a benefit to retaining old vines rather than uprooting them and going for more volume. So it goes right through from the consumer up backwards, I think. Right? It's the conviction within the trade is already there. It's growing fast. The support that we've had in the Old Vine Conference, the support that we have from our regional ambassadors, and the stories that Michele and Amanda have told us today are proof that the message is getting through at the producer level, that these are worth preserving, these old vines. But if there was an economic benefit as well, not just a cultural or a pat on the back for being a good boy, but an economic benefit to them, then I think it's got an even stronger chance of opening up and being retained. So my plea, if you like, as a call to action, is that you, as the influential wine writers of the world, you have an opportunity, a golden opportunity, to be part of this education process for the consumer. And so I hope that you'll be quite happy to join in if you can be convinced of the merits of old vine wine and the benefit that it has, not just in terms of its quality, but in all sorts of other ways as well, which we've discussed. Then I hope you can support this. Can we go to the next slide, Amanda? Belinda, not Amanda. So there it is. These are the options that are available to people who want to give more concrete support. Just mentioned, use your own media platform as a writer. You can join as an individual member of the Old Vine Conference, a regional ambassador, if you feel that there's a region which you know particularly a lot about, or which you represent and feel passionate about, which doesn't perhaps yet have a regional ambassador, you can go forward as well there. And of course, you can follow us, you can contact us. There are addresses at the foot of the page at the next slide, how you can get in touch with the Old Vine Conference as well to get involved. So I'm just checking to see whether there are more questions which I can answer.
I think there's one right at the beginning that Patricia asks about, does it matter whether the vines are own rooted, which you realise is a rare, or whether they were planted on rootstocks?
Right.
It's right at the beginning.
Oh yes, there we are. Does whether the vines are own rooted matter? Yeah. Okay. I honestly don't. I'm not strong in viticulture at all. I don't know. Is the answer? Does anybody else have an expertise in this particular field that they can help Patricia? It's not an area that I want to comment on, that I feel able to comment on.
I guess I could say something.
Please do, Wing. Yeah.
Mainly because I did attend the I don't know whether it was the last conference that I attended, but the one that was partly in person and partly online. And Joseph Wiamos did a presentation on the new organization that he is part of with many others about that supports ungrafted vines around the world. And he was saying that they are doing experiments. They're doing more and more experiments on ungrafted vines versus grafted vines in terms of the quality of the eventual wine and so on. And so they're working on that almost in tandem. And so it's like it's another group that's working on valuing old vines that happen to be ungrafted. And that I think if they're doing actual proper comparisons of the quality of the wine, it's very important, because that can then be talked about with consumers. And perhaps that would, I don't know whether we need to convey that more to promote old vines to consumers, but I think those of us who are educators as well, we do just that, and probably have done for decades. We've always said as educators, we are promoting old vines. I mean, we value wines made from old vines. But there we go. Sorry, Patricia, that didn't answer you.
Thank you, Wink. There's another question, obviously from Neil in the US. You say why there's nobody in the US, a bit like the Rioja question. I'm not sure whether they've been approached or it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, I could say something about that. It's we are a really small organization, and although we have made great strides in certain regions, you know, with the help of people like Michele and Amanda, the US and Spain are areas that we really do want to increase our visibility and awareness of the work that we're doing in those regions and in those countries. So anyone that has any help, any contacts, specializes in those countries and would like to get in touch, please do reach out to us. I did just mention in the comments that Sarah Abbott will be presenting making a presentation at the Barcelona Wine Week in February. So Spain is very much, we feel we're kind of building some real traction there. But yes, sometimes it is a case of kind of time, and the world is so big and there's so many amazing regions that are looking after old vines that we're kind of working our way around them. Is that fair to say, Alan?
Yes, I think if anybody out there does know of anybody in the US who they think would be a candidate for the regional ambassadorship for us, or to just be a point of contact in the US, we'd be very pleased to hear from you. But yes, Belinda's point is this is a very small organization. It's not a multi-skilled is the wrong word, but there's not a huge number of people to do the work. So we're very grateful for all sort of help that comes.
I'm sure we can help with the US somehow. I'm sure with I see Winnie Bowman's got her hand up there when he'd like to contribute here as well, our chairman.
Hi, thank you very much. That was all very interesting, and I'm actually sorry we didn't have somebody from South Africa on this afternoon. So that's why I had to put my hand up, Alun. But I just wanted to say about the value of old vines in South Africa, and that is that as you well pointed out, that there are many wine lists that actually do have a section for old vine wines. I visited the Mullineaux, who's obviously one of the more well-known old vine proponents in South Africa, and they've got a vineyard that is on the road, and it's actually not really demarcated as such. And they rehabilitated this vineyard for about 5 or 6 years before they got any grapes off it. And the day before they went to harvest, somebody had come in the night and cut all the grapes off and went off with it and sold it somewhere else. So now they actually, as soon as budding happens, they start putting security guards, 24-hour security guards around this vineyard so that it cannot be stolen. And twice they've actually thwarted a bunch of people who just came with a big truck, cutters, and they were just going to do what they did the previous years. So we do value our old vines. And of course, Rosa Kruger, who was the initiator of this, does extremely good work. And there is a much bigger awareness today of old vine wines, and particularly, as you say in the beginning, that an old vine wine is not necessarily a good wine. And now our consumers are very much happy, much more happy to pay more for these old vine wines, and they are very special and very, very sought after in South Africa. But thanks for highlighting South Africa this afternoon.
Well, it was a pleasure. But they do lead the way in terms of having a codified standard, because one of the problems in trying to persuade writers, we can urge writers to trumpet the value of old vines in every way. But what would be great is to have an internationally recognized system, but it's unlikely to happen because trying to pull together the ruling authorities from so many different countries with so many different cultures to agree on a unified definition of what an old vine is going to be very, very difficult. So, but it's great when one country can go ahead and make its own, like as South Africa has. It's hugely, as we've seen, it's hugely beneficial in terms of imparting knowledge to the consumer.
Well, I mean, they also do specific training for pruning of old vines, which is completely different to pruning other vines.
Yes, it goes beyond.
We've got some very highly skilled pruners who are now in great demand internationally, and that is something that you wouldn't have seen before, that a lowly vineyard worker would be sought after in another country, because they are asked to go somewhere and teach other people or lead a team or whatever. So very great, very good work that they do.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes, it goes beyond the simply commercial side. Yeah,
correct.
Well beyond. Okay, thank you, Wink, for that tip about California.
Okay, I think we've got 1 minute left sort of before we hit 3 o'clock. There's just one quick question from Liz. I know that Amanda had answered her question, but saying about, are there any other particular varieties whose old vines do extra well in extreme climatic conditions? No, nothing that springs to mind. No problem.
Nothing. I mean, it's only anecdotal. I mean, people, you know, as I go around the world and somebody will say, "Oh, my old vine Merlot did fantastically well in Pomerol during that drought, and I lost 80% of my crop from young." But I can't answer as to whether there's anything specific. It just seems to me that old vines do well in drought because they're so well established. I don't think there's necessarily one varietal that does better than another one.
Right.
In my experience.
No problem. And Neil was saying just there, here in the Willamette Valley, there are some vineyards that are over 50. They do have them in Willamette over 50 years old. So there's obviously room for expansion there as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if you want to close things, Michele. I think we've now.
Yeah, well, it was a great session. Thank you very much, Alun and Belinda, for being with us. And thanks everybody for joining. And Amanda, of course, who's gone off. And yeah, we really, you know, need to sustain and communicate. And I really hope that there will be a category for old vines everywhere soon, sometime. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.